Welcome to our speaker series. I'm Michael. I'm with the Bull Run Mountains Conservancy, and I serve as the director, and have been the director for the last 21 years. The speaker series we started about 3 years ago, and we try to, 10 months out of the year, have a speaker. And the idea was to do numerous things. Highlight various environmental organizations in the area, such as Prince William Conservation Alliance, Piedmont Environmental Council, Nova Parks, VOF, Virginia Outdoors Foundation, and to also then highlight various research projects that have gone on in the past, which I'll tie in a second with an archaeologist, and the research projects that we have done and worked with over the years, as well as bringing in unique perspectives and individuals who can speak to topics relevant to this geographic area, which is where Bob Jacobs comes in. Bob, I met
through Nancy.
Yeah, through Nancy, but like 18 months ago, 2 years, something like that. They came out to a naturalist walk, and just from listening to him that first walk, engaged just about everybody in the group, and they're in a way in which whatever their interests were, and to listen to the conversations, whether it was from one gentleman, Michael, who had roots to the University of Virginia and basketball and other things, and to you name it, and then our conversations. I quickly, after a few times being out in the woods with him, realized, well, I got to get Bob to do a program for us. And so I told him, I need you for the speaker series, and I need you to present. And it took time. We never thought it would end up in this format, but all the better. We're outside. Maybe we'll just do this permanently because it's better than being in a building. With that being said, I'm really happy to have him here today and to speak to the uniqueness of this particular geographic feature due to the geology of the Bull Run Mountains. This narrow gap that it doesn't seem as narrow because they blasted 66 through it, but you have to envision way back when just how narrow it was, and the fact that you're looking across the Triassic Basin. If you ever come out of Trader Joe's and you're on 66 and you can see all the way to the mountain line, that's the Triassic Basin. Flat basin. When the Epitus Ocean was formed and the continents pulled apart, tons of sediment filled in because it's like a souffle with many cracks. The Triassic Basin is one of the basins that filled in with sediments, 20,000 feet of sediments. And so there's various sandstones, siltstones, where we find dinosaur tracks because of the fine nature of it. And that flat landscape, you will notice the Culpeper Basin. If you're ever going down 29, you can see way into the distance. If you're on 66 and you look behind you coming out of that Trader Joe's, you'll notice that you hit the rolling Piedmont and you can't see in the distance. You don't see very far. That made this a very special place because of that Triassic Basin. If you are Paleo Indians, you can see the mountain, you can see the gap. And usually what causes a gap? Water. And so we had an archaeologist, did work on the mountain, did work at Chapman's Mill, and presented for us. And he has dated artifacts back 12,700 years. And what a water gap is, it was a meeting place. So for those Paleo Indians that live farther west, more mountainous, Shenandoah Valley, their access to geologic stones, which are so important as far as everything in their life and existence as tools, hunting, you name it, are different than those that live in the coastal plain. And so this mountain became a meeting place where they could share materials and that they would gather together. And so that's how far back that the gap's history goes from a human standpoint. And then I'm not going to go further because that's why Bob's here, to bring you up more to how it actually affected this particular nation, the United States, and how significant the gap was. That being said, just one shout out to White House Farm Foundation for allowing us to do this program and to use their site. Laura Hassel, the executive director of White House Farm Foundation, Scott Pline, whose foundation it is, provided 384 acres under conservation easement that they do numerous things to help enhance the landscape. We love the fact that we're part of that puzzle and we're sponsored to do programs, and we're just happy to be here. We're happy to have that partnership with the White House Farm Foundation. And so, and thank you for coming, because that, without you, then we don't have any programs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Oh wait, one last thing before he talks. Bob is, I called him when promoting this program, he is a man who has the knowledge of professorship and beyond, but he was a high school history teacher, so he can communicate.
We hope. The conceit when I started this thing was, I said to Michael, or we wrote this up in the blurb, you'd be forgiven if you are driving on I-66 and you looked over to the side and you saw that 6-story stone-stacked mill, and you went further west, maybe headed for the Shenandoah Valley, and you went past hamlets and small villages and farms, and it was a pastoral landscape that just bespoke peace, and you thought, this is a place where people, followed the seasons, worked, lived and died, their local communities, their churches, and they were far removed, maybe thankfully, from the drama of big events and cataclysmic events. You couldn't be more wrong, because history happened here. You might think nothing much ever happened here, like Lincoln said of his family, the short and simple annals of the poor, the working poor. But history happened here, and significant history happened here. So, as Michael said, as you look to the Blue Ridge, you can see that this landscape is cut by a variety of streams and rivers, Goose Creek and Broad Run, and numerous waterways, and one of them being the Broad Run falls 1,300 feet, falls 87 feet in 1,300 feet as it comes through this water gap that's been created over the eons, and that is the Thoroughfare Gap. It was a source of egress, a portal, if you will, to the west, and that's going to be very important. It was important to the Indians for trade. The wheat production and grain production is now down on the northern neck, from Fredericksburg down toward, but in colonial times and even in pre-colonial times, that was sort of the breadbasket of Virginia. It would become kind of the granary of the nation once rail lines were run over to the Shenandoah. So this became, as he said, a portal to the west. But it also, because of that creek, had within its boundaries a water source, a power source. And as you know, whether you're milling lumber or you're grinding grains into flour or something like that, you need a power source. So by the 1740s, the Chapman family had built the first of those mills. Jonathan had built the mill, and then in 1770, Pearson Chapman built a stone structure. This is the beginning. And by the way, Atlas Obscura says this is perhaps the tallest stone structure, ballast stone structure in the United States, in North America, the one that presently exists. And of course, that was added on to. It was only 2 stories, but then it was built to 5.5 or 6 stories by John Chapman, a sort of tragic figure, in 1858. Why did he do that? Well, people were keenly aware as technology increased, and I said it was a granary early on when Washington was besieging Yorktown and needed supplies to keep the troops fed while they besieged the English at Yorktown. Beef and grain was sent from the Shenandoah Valley that he said sustained the army, made the difference, but was able to keep both the French and American troops in the field against the English. So early on it was, but if it could be transported, that could be a market for the world. And so it would come to pass. In the let me locate it for you, that might help. We were going to use visuals, but can everybody see this? That yellow marker you can see, I hope you can see, that's the Thoroughfare Gap, okay? And you can see the Blue Ridge here, right? The Blue Ridge Mountains here, and the Alleghenies here, and in between is the Shenandoah Valley, cut by the Shenandoah River, okay? And you can see that as a transit coming off of the Potomac River, for example, this is in a direct line. So if there's a gap in the mountains, it's going to be a strategic gap. It's going to be a very important gap. And that is what it would be. Can you see the orange? What I've done for you there is I've transposed what would happen. And that is in the 19th century, this is the age of railroad building, a spider web, a concatenation of rail lines would all come together. And you could see One of them that runs over into the all-important Shenandoah Valley comes right through the Thoroughfare Gap. They've got to build that rail line through the mountains. Where better than a water gap or a wind gap? And there are 11 major gaps in the Blue Ridge that let you get over. You know Snickers Gap, you know Thornton Gap where you go into the Shenandoah Park, you know Ashby Gap, that beautiful Route 50 over into Winchester. Well, before we get to those gaps, we've got to come through the Bull Run Mountains, and this is Thoroughfare Gap. So in 1850, the Commonwealth incorporated a business operation that would build the Manassas Gap Railroad, and it was consolidated in 1850, and then in 1852 came through Thoroughfare Gap. 1854 they've reached Strasburg over in the valley. 1859 they've gone all the way down to Mount Jackson. So now this is an important rail line that's going over there, and by that point, by 1860, in the 1850-60, 90% of the farmers in the Shenandoah Valley were growing grain of some type. Because once you put it on those trains and you brought it through the mountains to the east, to the Potomac River, as I showed you, you're now picking up the ports and you're loading it there and you're selling our provender, our grain, to Europe and beyond. And that would be Dumfries and Alexandria. But after they've extended the rail lines, once you get over there, you can come in here, you can go all the way up to Baltimore, another big port. And Baltimore would, at some point in the early 20th century, be the 6th largest city in the United States. It was a big city. It's like 23rd or something now. It's lost population. So you can see how important this little segment would be. It was not lost on military planners either. For in July 1861, you might remember in April 1861, the Civil War broke out over the bombardment of Fort Sumter and a number of other incidents, and a battle was taking place on the plains of Manassas, as it was called at that time. Confederate troops were coming up to the north to defend Northern Virginia, which was Virginia being a Confederate state. Yankee troops were coming out from Washington, D.C. Their enlistments were running out, so it was predictable. The Southerners knew that the Yankees were going to try something before the enlistments ran out, so they said they're going to push south. Where can we meet them? We can meet them along the Bull Run. It's a natural fortification. While these two forces opposed each other, Yankees coming out of Washington, D.C. south toward Manassas, right? Southerners coming up from Fredericksburg and from the south to defend along the Bull Run. There were two opposing forces way over at Harper's Ferry, which is Virginia at that point. This Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It hasn't become West Virginia yet. The Yankees had an arsenal there, gun manufacturing and munitions and all of that sort of thing. Joseph Johnston's forces were opposing the Yankees in that citadel. He took a fraction of his force, faked toward the armory. They became convinced a major battle was going to take place. He peeled off most of his troops under Stonewall Jackson. They ran down and jumped on the train at Delaplane. It would then have been called Piedmont Station. And they rode into that battle that was taking place at Manassas, right on the flank of the Yankee army. It was the first time in recorded history that troops were moved into an active military engagement by rail. And you can imagine the shock of the Yankees. The Yankees are fighting, and they're starting to push against the Confederates. Their telegraphs are saying, Harper's Ferry is being besieged. You've got nothing to worry about on your flank, on your right flank. Nothing's coming that way. Well, they were coming that way, and they were coming by rail, and they were coming through Thoroughfare Gap. So both sides began to realize anytime you wanted a misdirection thing, you could fake one way, send troops another way through the gap. So what the Confederates did after the Yankees got their act together and pushed south from Washington, D.C., they controlled Northern Virginia. The powers that be, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, decided it would be folly to leave that rail line open for the Yankees to use, because then they could slide over into the Shenandoah, destroy the Shenandoah, pop out of one of the gaps south, come into Richmond via Charlottesville. Question. Okay, so the rail line was destroyed. What the Confederates decided was, let's eliminate that. That poses more of a danger to us in some ways than it does to the Yankees. We don't want them to be able to slide over into the Shenandoah Valley. One, because it provides the food for the Confederacy, for the Army of Northern Virginia anyway, right? Secondly, they could go south in the valley. It's actually going up the valley, but it's go south in the valley and then pop out at, one of the gaps, Thornton Gap or whatever, behind Confederate forces. So they ripped the rail line up. So for the remainder of the war, this was Mumford's cavalry and Turner Ashby. So this would have been May 23rd, 1862. But before they retreated, sadly for our little local community here in John Chapman, the Confederates had been using the mill and the areas around the mill as a slaughterhouse and an abattoir to process beef for the troops. They burned 2 million pounds of beef, destroyed the outbuildings, and left. So for the first time, John Chapman sees his life work, this beautiful mill destroyed, and some of the outbuildings destroyed. He's despondent. He's almost beside himself. Little did he realize, 5 months later, he's going to go through it. He rebuilds it, and the forces are going to arrive there, and it's going to get destroyed a second time. So this is a real tragedy for this little community. But the rail lines are ripped up, and at that point, the troops are down along. I don't know if I can show you very well on this map. Okay. Get a good look. See if you can find the Rappahannock River here. This blue river on the bottom, if you will, lower right-hand corner. You see the Rappahannock? Does everybody see the Rappahannock? Yeah. See the Rappahannock? Okay, so after Bull Run, we have the Peninsula Campaign, where the Yankees have a chance to take Richmond. They can hear the church bells. They can see the steeples. They're within 8-10 miles of the center of Richmond. They fail. They move north. Lincoln is completely disgusted with McClellan, feels like he should have taken it. He reorganizes the Union Army. But the two armies stalemate along the Rappahannock. The Yankees are on the north of the Rappahannock, and the Southerners are along the south bank. But the Yankees are getting troops by the score. There's a very famous hymn, "We are coming, Father Abraham, 20,000 strong." They are enlisting, and Lee understands it's a matter of numbers. At some point, they'll be so outnumbered that the Yankees can just stretch, find where they find the end of the Confederate lines and lop around them. He's got to do something. He also has another objective. He would like to get that Union Army, Rappahannock is in Fauquier County, all of Northern Virginia is sustaining the Yankee Army. That means they're going in and requisitioning food from they're taking pigs, hogs, whatever they find, chickens, taking corn out of the field. So we're in July and August, and he comes up with a daring plan. He wants to get them out of Northern Virginia. He's got 3 strategic objectives. One would be to get the Yankees to retreat north to rest the populace of this area, the farmers and the local populace and the agriculture of the area. 2, he'd like to menace Washington, D.C. in some way. He'd like to destroy the morale of the North. They've had some disappointments already. They failed to take Richmond. They lost at first Bull Run. Another one might do the trick. Remember, there's a big anti-war movement. And it's a time-honored trick that if you can deliver a morale-deflating defeat on your enemy when he's trying to sustain the political effort at home, think of the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. Absolutely timed for the 1968 election. This is the same case here. This is 1862, late. What's going to happen in November? Elections. Who's on the ballot in the North? Well, there are people who think we should prosecute the war, but then there are people who say, like Horace Greeley, warring sisters go in peace. This war is costing too much in money. It's costing too much in our children. I live in Geneva, New York, or Rochester, New York. My kids are getting killed for what? Because if somebody wants to own slaves in Louisiana, let them go. So he's got 2 objectives. One, get the North off off of southern soil, if you will, to do something in terms of morale in the north, and maybe change the course of the elections up there. That's important. So he comes up with an incredible strategy, tactic, I would say, I suppose. He is going to go around behind. He can't force the Yankees off the Rappahannock River. It's too difficult to cross. When you cross with an army, you got to bring your artillery, you've got to bring your munitions, you got to bring your food. All right, you've got to do all of those things, and so the Rappahannock serves as a kind of moat. So rather than, he tries a frontal assault, but it fails. So what he does is he fakes again as a frontal assault, but then he sends Stonewall Jackson all the way around. He says, if you can do two things, if you can cut the rail line, this Orange and Alexandria rail line here, then the North can't shove troops and supplies out of Washington, D.C. to Pope's army down here. And the second thing is, after you've done that, if you can turn and get to Manassas Junction, that's where they store all of the munitions, all of the food, all of the equipment. And if you can bag that, our men eat for another 6 months. It's like a piñata or a cornucopia that we'll have. Now, one thing you need to realize, I suppose, is there is bad blood in the Union ranks, if you will. Let me go back to this for just 1 second. I told you that Lincoln reorganized the army. And what he did was he took ultimate command away from McClellan, who was the soldiers' favorites, and he gave it to a guy named John Pope. And John Pope was a braggart, shameless self-promoter, and the troops generally didn't like him. He was then put in overall command of McClellan's troops and his own troops. Now, Napoleon used to say, if I have to fight someone, make it be some kind of an alliance. And I just wanted to read you this one quick quote from Pope to the troops. Now, let's say you're working for Bull Run Mountains Conservancy, and you get a new boss, and the boss comes in and says, I realize most of you here are pretty sorry, and then you haven't been doing a very good job. I'm here to teach you how to do your job right. What do you think morale is going to be like at BMRC? Here's what Pope says to these troops when he takes over. Look, he comes from the West. He comes to these Eastern troops who've been doing all the fighting. He says, let us understand each other. I have come from the West, where we have always seen the backs of our enemies, from an army whose business has been to seek the adversary and to beat him when he's found, whose policy has been attack, not defense. Meantime, I desire you to dismiss from your mind certain phrases which I'm sorry to find are much in vogue amongst you all. I hear constantly of taking a strong position and holding it, or of lines of retreat, or of bases of supplies. Let us discard such ideas. We're going on the attack, and I'm going to make soldiers out of you. Well, morale is horrible. And during the course of the battles that will follow, there are allegations that McClellan's troops didn't break their necks to come to Pope's aid when he was in dire straits. There were actually court-martials after this engagement. In fact, when it's over, Alpheus Williams says, Alpheus Williams being a Union general who served under Pope, says, when a general boasts that he will look only on the backs of his enemies, that he takes no care for lines of retreat or bases of supplies, when in short, from a snug hotel in Washington, he issues after-dinner orders to gratify public taste and his own self-esteem, anyone may confidently look for such results as have followed the bungling management of this last campaign. Lee, who never spoke badly of anybody he opposed, he had been superintendent of West Point, so most of the Union generals had been cadets under Robert E. Lee when he ran West Point. And he generally never said anything negative. He said there are opponents, that sort of thing. The only person, there's a recorded instance, he had something negative to say was Pope. And he said, he is a miscreant who must be suppressed. So it is personal. But Brigadier General Sam Sturgis had the best quote on him. He said, I don't care for John Pope one pinch of owl dung. So now these are troops serving under him. So you get Someone else said, more insolence, superciliousness, ignorance, and pretentiousness were never concentrated more in one man. So you've got a serious morale problem amongst the Yankee forces. The one thing I did want to point out to you on this ride is this is unbelievable, because he's asking Jackson to go behind with an inferior force. He's got maybe 20,000 troops, and he's looking at 75,000 troops here between him and Lee. So if they discover he's in their rear and they turn on him, you would expect a bloodbath. So it's speed. If he can move fast enough, they won't realize what's happened. He'll achieve the two objectives. He'll cut the rail line, the umbilical cord to Washington that's sending the troops and the equipment, and he will bag all of the goodies at Manassas Junction. But if he doesn't move fast enough, it won't happen. So what do you think? You're a super looper hiker. 25 miles the first night, 25 miles. He went 54 miles in 2 days. Now, if you guys are hikers and you're knocking out 3.5 miles an hour hiking, you're doing okay. So you're looking at, what, 2 8-hour days of 3.5 or 3 miles an hour. That's astounding. And then get up the next morning and do it again. And he's gonna ask Longstreet to do the same thing. So he's gonna do it twice. He violates the most important military commandment. Napoleon's never unconcentrate an inferior force in front of a superior force. In other words, if you've got fewer men than your opponent, whatever you do, don't divide that into two small wings, because the big guy can turn on either of the two small wings and crush it like a bug. So this takes unbelievable nerve. You know, my wife and I, Nancy, we used to have to go to a lot of educational meetings. We were classroom teachers, so we were really interested in education, not administration. And we would have to go to those things, and Nancy said, if we learn 2 new things, then we have no right to complain. If we don't learn anything, we have a right to, just grouse about it all the time. So if you leave with 1 or 2 things that you have learned, maybe Napoleon's dictum, never unconcentrate in front of a superior force, whatever, the importance of the gap in connecting with the Shenandoah Valley, and how that made the Shenandoah Valley in some ways because of the rail line taking the produce to the ports. If you've learned those things, that was the first time troops were moved in history into combat, then maybe it isn't a waste of your time. The other thing I was going to tell you was, and if anybody has a question, this is such a small little intimate group. Instead of me talking at you, just say, hey, I didn't get that, or whatever. That's what we're here for. So I wanted to tell you that Lee was older, had gray in his beard, and oh God, here we go. When he took over, people felt that he was insufficiently aggressive, because he built trenches around Richmond in case Richmond was besieged. And so the troops started calling him, this is the 19th century, and you've got an awful lot of romanticized show-offs like Jeb Stuart and other people with ostrich plumes in their hats. And my headquarters, Pope said, my headquarters are in the saddle. Somebody said, your headquarters are where your hindquarters are. But, he was the antithesis of that. He was modest. He did what was essentially smart. It didn't look daring. It ended up being saving Richmond. But he was called Granny Lee. And some of them called him the King of Spades because he dug in. And one of his subordinates said, he's the most audacious man you've ever met. His name should be Audacity. He'll take more chances than anybody. He may look like an old man. This is one of the most audacious things he could have done. And it came off without a hitch. Jackson managed to get there and he left on the 25th. On the 26th, he's through the gap. And on the 26th and 27th, he derails the train and cuts the line at Bristow, wrecks 3 trains actually. Then goes on to Manassas Junction and bags that cornucopia. The first thing he has to say, though, is destroy all the whiskey barrels. Any alcohol. He has because he knows his troops. They're going to get loaded if they get a chance, because but they are going into the sutlers' wagons and getting canned lobster, and and these are guys who have been eating hardtack and green corn out of the field. So he's got to control them. He then retreats to an unfinished railroad cut. There was an extension of the Manassas Gap Railroad that they were going to build, and so they built the cut through the woods. It's a natural trench, and he retreats Jackson after he bags all this stuff, and he's going to await Longstreet. Longstreet is going to do the same thing. Longstreet is going to come to his aid, and he better come to his aid, because Jackson, with, as I said to you, shy of 20,000 troops, is here at Manassas, and all of the Yankees are headed for him. Maybe 85,000, 75,000 certainly. He is going to be annihilated if Longstreet can't get to him and help him. Longstreet makes the same run. He comes off the river, they come up through Orleans, then they come to Salem, which is Marshall, and then they come to the White Plains, which is the plains. And right, you can see Salem, White Plains, you see those are the names, this is the map, and they're headed for the Thoroughfare Gap. Cavalry scouts for the Yankees spot them and tell the Yankee command, Longstreet is coming to help Jackson. This gap, as Michael said, may not look, you don't need much elevation over an attacking force to have a tremendous advantage as they lug up the hill. The military doctrine then, and probably even now, is you need a 3-to-1 advantage if somebody has high ground and you're going to take it. The attacking force better have 3 to the 1 on the hill, because that's how strong a defense the hill is. Now, the 2 hills that are on either side of the gap, Old Mother Leathercoat to the north, high point is, I think, 1,311 feet. The other side is Pond Mountain, and that's 889 feet. So you've got these two. Now, the mill is at 423 feet. So you've got essentially, 400 feet looking down and over 1,000 feet looking down. So whoever controls those hills controls blocks the gap. Okay, and some people think it's what they call the American Thermopylae, and you might remember when the Persians under Xerxes in 480 BCE were attacking. Did you sleep through that one? Okay. Well, let me explain it to you. The Persians invaded Greece. They had a huge army. They were going to smash Athens and Sparta, that were the 2 Greek city-states that stood up to them. 300 Spartans. This is real famous. Your kids would know this. The 300s, big movie about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it was. King Leonidas and 300 Spartans got in that tiny gap, Thermopylae, and they blocked tens of thousands of Persians from coming through there until they were betrayed by another Greek who showed them a road around the gap. Well, this is exactly what's going to happen here, and it's called the American Thermopylae. The Moxley Sorrell, who is a Confederate, talks about how the deep, dark defile, and if you fire a shot, you can hear the echoes go down through the Thoroughfare Gap. It's a dramatic landscape at that point. And as Michael said, it's been widened since. So it was very narrow, and obviously if Longstreet can't get through there, he can't get to Jackson. Kids sometimes would say something about, well, couldn't he go this way, couldn't he go that? Armies have to stick to infrastructure. They have to stick to the roads, because they're bringing the artillery, they're bringing the ammunition, they're bringing the food, they're bringing the ambulance wagons for the wounded. You can't go where there isn't a road, and the road goes through these mountains at Thoroughfare Gap. So if that gap is plugged, and perhaps the game is afoot. Now Jackson is stranded out there without any help. The Yankees are moving on him, and you can see what happens. I need to finish this up for you here quickly. If you can see the yellow, you can see Old Mother Leathercoat, and you can see Pond Mountain, and you can see Longstreet is moving. By the way, I should have said this earlier. Red, whether you're using a West Point atlas or any military atlases or histories, red is always the enemy. So if this was a World War II map, Japan would be red. The Nazis would be red. American troops would always be blue. If we're doing the Civil War, and this might offend you if you went to Auburn, the Americans are going to be blue, and and the enemy is going to be red. But just go with it. All right, so you can see Lee is in overall command, but he has 2 wings, Jackson and Longstreet, and he lets them kind of operate independently. They are headed for the gap. The cavalry, as I said, and there are tremendous characters. One of them is a guy who was just recently a prisoner of war of the Confederates, but he was released in a swap like a week before the battle, so now he's back in the saddle. Percy Wyndham, he is out here, and he spots Longstreet headed for there. And there's another guy named John Buford, terribly attractive guy, very solid guy from Kentucky. Half his family is in the Confederacy. He refuses to go with the Confederacy. He's a West Pointer. He's taken an oath to defend the Constitution. That's what he's going to do. They're out there. They spot Longstreet. Wyndham, who has a handlebar mustache that comes out 6 inches on either side of his face, and when he's agitated, he twists it in the middle of the battle, and the men look up and go, well, it's getting tense. Percy's twisting the mustache. Percy would go to Siam after the war and be a military advisor to the King of Siam, and he was killed in a hot air balloon crash over Royal Lake in Rangoon. Fell out of the sky. That was the end of Percy. He was quite a character. So the question is now, Pope, you know, I'm the genius, I'll tell you how to run this sort of thing. With his troops, he's got all of his troops. They're coming through the gap right now as I speak. I was going to say Turner Ashby, who ripped up the rail lines here in May of '62, when they decided they didn't want the Yankees to use it. He's a local boy. He's from Markham, and he's the Beau Sabreur. He's really Jeb Stuart before Jeb Stuart, the Black Knight, and he's killed two weeks after he rips up the rail lines here. He's defending Jackson down in the valley, and he's killed right outside of Harrisonburg. But cavalry is very important for those reasons. It's out, it's spying, it's running back saying this is where the enemy is, this is what we have to do. The Yankees get that information, particularly Pope. And Pope's left wing, if you will, over here is made up of McDowell and Sigel. McDowell comes from McClellan's army, so he doesn't much like Pope, but he's under his control. They're headed this way. McDowell gets the message. Longstreet's right here. I'm here. I'm here. I've got 25, 30,000 troops I can block that gap with. Should I send somebody to block the gap? He decides he's going to send somebody to block the gap, the American Thermopylae. He conveys that to Pope before he sends the troops. Pope says, forget about it. Don't get distracted. We've got Jackson. Come on to Manassas. He lets him take a token force under James Ricketts and send them into the gap, but there are only 5,000. Will they get there in time? Will there be enough of them? That is the question. Percy Wyndham, meanwhile, knowing that help might be on its way, starts cutting down trees on the road leading into the gap. Ironically, that's going to work against the Yankees, because when the Yankees finally try to get to the gap, the trees are on the east side of the gap, and they have to make their way. They have to clear the roads to get the cavalry through. James Ricketts does get there. He runs into the advanced forces that Longstreet has sent. There you can see in blue, this is Ricketts with 5,000 troops, James Ricketts, an extremely attractive veteran. He had fought in First Bull Run in July of 1861, held his position so long, he was wounded 4 times, very critically, carried off by the Confederates and sent to prison of war camp, probably Libby, down in Richmond. They allowed his wife to come through the lines and nurse him back. He would have died. She nursed him back to health. Fanny, that's a wife. And when he gets his health back, they say, well, we're going to hang you because we've heard the Yankees are going to hang some of our scouts as spies, and so if they hang them, you're going to be hanged. So your wife did a nice job, but prepare yourself. Well, the Yankees called off their hanging, and so Ricketts was allowed to live, and then there was a prisoner exchange. So now Ricketts, who's been shot 4 times and overrun because he didn't get any help at First Manassas, is in charge here with 5,000 men facing 25,000. So as he stands on that crested the hill and he's looking at that gap. He's thinking, how long should I hold this? Do you think I should hold it as long as I did last time? You know, my grandfather used to have a saying, there's no education in the second kick of a mule. You know, if you didn't get it the first time, you ain't gonna get it. So Ricketts probably thinking of Thermopylae with King Leonidas of the Spartans. When he was betrayed, he was captured, he was beheaded. So Ricketts decides, probably time to get out of Dodge. What happens is, as you might expect, with all this many more troops, Lee very quickly dispatches troops out either side. He says that's a small force, we'll get beyond its end, we'll flank it. And to just to be on the safe side, I'm going to send Cadmus Wilcox's troops, I'm going to send Evander Laws up on Old Mother Leathercoat, and I'm going to send Evander Laws around through Hopewell Gap. And if he stays there, he's going to be between our two armies and we're going to crush him like a walnut. So Ricketts has made the great decision. The battle for these two heights is critical. This is on August 28th. And the Confederates, under the Georgians, they get up on top of Pond Mountain before the Massachusetts troops arrive. It was Daniel Webster's son, Fletcher Webster, who will be killed a couple of days later down at Second Manassas. So the Confederates establish a position on top there. The fighting here is a little trickier. If you go, and I had slides of it and all kinds of things, but there's a quarry where they took the stone to build the mill. And it was 25 feet wide and 15 feet deep at some points, and it was only 10 feet wide and 5 feet deep in others, and they were actually could touch bayonets across the thing. They're firing into each other, but somebody said it was like fighting on a barn roof. They were going over either side, and that thing went back and forth. But as I said to you, as Lee was able to extend it, he finally flanked Ricketts. Ricketts then got out of Dodge and made a run back to where he had come at Gainesville and then on and rejoined. Longstreet then pushes through and makes his way to Jackson.
There's just one interesting note. So the Bull Run Mountains, the geology, when you think about it being thrusted up in the very eastern edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Bull Run Mountains there, the eastern slope is less. So the Confederates are coming up the western slope, which means every time they get to that quarry, they can just duck down 3 feet and they can't shoot at them. Where when they're at the quarry in the Union, if they have to go back, they have a much longer range to shoot them because the slope is much less. So they had a geologic advantage. Well, that gave them a geographic advantage.
Yeah, good point. Terrain.
The terrain was in their
All right,
favor.
so this is what it looks like down at Manassas after Longstreet has pushed his way through. Longstreet is coming in this way, red, you can see. Jackson is here. Jackson has run out of ammunition. He's fighting with rocks. He's in that railroad cut. They're literally picking up rocks. This is how much nerve Jackson has. Jackson and Lee are willing to take chances that, boy, you know, timing a couple of hours and it would have been a completely different case. Longstreet comes in. The Yankees are coming to attack Jackson in the railroad cut. And Lee says, hit him. Just pitch right in. And Longstreet says, no, there's a missing unit. Our intelligence tells us that there's Yankees out there. If I go in, they're likely to come in behind me and hit me. It's Fitzjohn Porter. And he says, someone's out in the off the air. Let him come in and let them start across, because by then I'll have my artillery and I'll hit them in the flank as they're going toward Jackson tomorrow. Lee accedes to his subordinates' wisdom. He says, yeah, okay, I think you know what you're doing. We'll do it your way. And it is one of the massacres of the war. They just practically extinguish Pope's forces. However, there are Westerners in there. You know, I've always said, I'm going to wrap this thing up, that Jackson gets a lot of credit. He's a genius and Lee's a genius. But in a sense, particularly Jackson in the Valley campaign, he's fighting against the JV. He's fighting against people that were political appointments. They weren't seasoned veterans. As the war went on and you got the Grants and the Shermans and the Sheridans, now you're fighting varsity against varsity, and the fights end quite differently. There are like N.P. Banks, who had been Speaker of the House, is in charge of the Army over in the Shenandoah Valley. NP was Nathaniel Prentice, but the troops said nothing positive, NP. So you got an idea. Schimmelpfennig was put in because he was a German, and they were hoping to hold the Germans, German Americans loyal in Missouri. So there were political appointments. This guy was an abolitionist, Ambrose Burnside. He was put in there because of his politics, not because of his military prowess. But that gets weeded out, and it gets to be a much fairer fight. One thing also is, you know, the Yankees are recruiting from cities, and immigrants particularly. Sheridan is right off the boat practically, from Ireland. And someone said, don't give us any of those Krauts, give us the bog trotters, the Irish. They like to fight. That was the quote. They fight with each other if they can't have it. There's a very famous incident in the Battle of Gettysburg where there is an Irish population in New Orleans. I don't know if you knew that. And Savannah, those are one of the, you know, the South didn't have many immigrants, but it had some in the port cities, particularly in New Orleans. They had some Irish, and there were plenty of Irish in Boston and, you know, New York and all of that. And there is an exchange between a Yankee Irishman who's taken prisoner of war and a Confederate Irishman, and the two Irish guys meet, and he goes, "You're fighting for them, are you, Patrick?" He says, "Yeah, I'm fighting for my." He said, "They're slave owners. They're just like the English, you coward," and this, that. He said, "Well, I'll have you." He said, "Well, you're a real man." So he says, "The hell with this," and he throws down something. The two Irish guys go out and start fighting between the two armies. The two armies just kind of put down their weapons and watch these two guys have a fight in the brickyard at Gettysburg. So you got some idea of the, you know, of the personnel. But what I wanted to tell you was the Yankees had now gotten farm boys from Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana, and they formed a brigade called the Iron Brigade. And these guys were kids who had grown up like the Southerners with a gun in their hand out hunting behind the farm. And these kids could fight. And when they got pushed out at 2nd Manassas, they retreated, but they didn't run like 1st Manassas. And one of the things is, you know, I think it was Will Rogers who said, it's important to only take as much wisdom out of an experience as in the experience. He said a cat who's jumped on a hot stove plate will never jump on a hot stove plate again. But he'll never jump on a cold stove plate either. Lee sees a victory, and he says, their morale is shot. This is the time for me. I know we've really been stressed. I know this is difficult, but we need to take it to the North right now. They're on the run. They're disorganized. They've just gotten whipped the second time. If I can knock them out, remember the elections, this is September 1862. If I can knock them out now, the Peace Democrats will win the elections, the Union will be out of the war, it'll impress the English, and it'll impress the French, both of whom need cotton for textiles. They'll recognize the South and break the blockade. This is a win-win-win. He goes up to Western Maryland, he goes to Antietam, and he fights the single bloodiest battle in the history of the United States. 4 times the casualties of defeat. This is September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, if you will. All right. So he misread it, and he overreached, and he got his nose very badly bloodied. Had McClellan been more of a warrior, he would have been extinguished at Antietam. So there are many things that come in the, you know. There are so many what ifs. What if Longstreet had been blocked and they had taken out Jackson? The South probably would have collapsed. That's half the Army of Northern Virginia. The South would have sued for peace. We would have let them back in the Union and allowed, there's no 13th Amendment, there's no emancipation. There would have still been slavery. The only condition would be it couldn't be extended to the territories. That's what the Civil War started with. There was no, we're going to take your slaves. You can have your slaves. You had them from the beginning. The Constitution recognized that. So this war would have been over in a very incomplete fashion if the Union had won early in the war. And they could have won early in the war. On the other hand, you know, had Lee been able to get to the North and keep driving, his battle plans were found wrapped around 3 cigars in a field. He sent them out to his corps commanders. Somebody put the orders, wrapped them around their cigars, and they left them, and the Yankees found them. So they knew where he was, and it's a long story. Okay, so I wanted to say now this lovely part of the world returned to what it was. Small community of freed blacks started schools here in 1885. A freed black named Frank Fletcher Well, they were all free by 1885, but there had been a small community of free blacks, and then the newly emancipated blacks, they built a school, and if you walk through Leopold's Preserve, you'll see 1885, the North Fork School, and then the Antioch North Fork School, till 1953. You know, they're in these small schools out here. There are colored schools, if you will. And the rest of it, if you drive down here on 55 and you go into...
Can I add just one thing to that?
Yeah, sure.
So that Antioch Macomb School, that actually was in existence to 1982. And after desegregation, it actually was a black school that then got integrated with white students, which is just basically unheard of. From direct knowledge, the AHA did Eye on the Prize years ago, one episode a month, and you could sit in the audience, and afterwards they did discussion groups. And for all of these Fauquier County experiences, that those black schools, they were not only dismantled, but they took the students and they spread them across the entire county, and they segregated them from themselves, and they ended up alone. They're no friends. They just got stuck alone. And so when you think of the history of that school, you think, how in the world was this a different situation where the blacks got to keep their school, and then the integration it came the other way? And it has to have an unbelievable brave story from individuals to make that happen. And the shame of it all, and I hate to say it, but the first developer who used this and created this man-made wetland so that they could do their development, because they're taking out wetlands, they totally destroyed all evidence in the school. It's completely gone.
I taught Fauquier County, and my first senior class of kids that I had to put through had all started school in segregated schools in Fauquier County. And this is in 1975.
To hear their direct stories, it was the most telling, moving, crushing thing I've ever heard.
Let me get these people out of here, Michael. I just want to leave you with a thought. Now, this is something that Steve...
We think you're trying to escape.
No, I'm not. Mark Twain said it's a terrible death to be talked to death. I mean, I understand that. All right. I'm in a self-help group. It's called On and On. Anyway, here we go. Listen to this. This is about Antietam, and then we're done, okay? And this applies, I'm reading about Antietam, but I'm thinking about Thoroughfare Gap, right? Before the armies came, Sharpsburg, Maryland, Antietam, was a quiet place, an entirely ordinary rural community where the roads came together. In September 1862, it was just short of being a century old, having been founded a dozen years before the Revolution and named in honor of Maryland colonial governor Horatio Sharp. Its main street was called Main Street, and there was the usual proportion of churches, taverns, and stores, with 1,300 residents living in unprepossessing frame houses scattered along side streets and lanes. Some of them worked on the nearby Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, or at the ironworks a few miles away at the mouth of Antietam Creek. But mostly, they made their living as shopkeepers and blacksmith and gristmill hands serving the farming trade. A good many of the local farmers were of sturdy German stock with names like Rohrbach and Mumma and Otto and Puffenberger, and they had made the land bloom. In neatly fenced fields, the corn stood tall, and the orchards were heavy with fruit, and the haylofts in the big barns were full. Life in Sharpsburg might have continued on in its pleasant, uneventful way, unremarked by history like 1,000 other little towns dotting the American landscape, except for that suddenly all-important fact that it was the place where the roads came together, and that's where the armies lived. So that is sort of the history of Thoroughfare Gap. This is why this became the center of attention and the what-ifs. What if, Longstreet had been blocked? Wonderful audience.
I got a question.
We have questions.
One question.
Yes.
What would you say was the pivotal point that starved? What do you think was the pivotal point that starved the Union from victory? What was the pivotal point that starved the Union from victory?
Starved the Union from victory?
Right. I mean, What I mean
Here, you mean at Second Manassas?
I mean, right, from Second Manassas.
well, I mean, if they'd have blocked
like,
Longstreet, they would have annihilated Jackson, I think.
Right. Okay. Okay.
That becomes, that's why this is history happened here.
Right.
You know.
And I've only been to Gettysburg one time, but when I was looking at your map, I saw kind of a Chamberlain pivot, kind of that the Union didn't develop.
Yeah, the 20th Maine. Yeah.
I mean, when looking at that first map,
Yeah.
it looked like the Union could have kind of like let Longstreet in and kind of just
Well,
everything around.
and maybe I've oversimplified it because obviously Pope thought with all of those troops where they were, he was going to crush Jackson before Longstreet could get there.
Right.
But you're
Okay.
dealing with armies that went 25 miles in a
Right.
day.
Okay.
They called Jackson's men foot cavalry for a reason. And the Valley campaign, they averaged 14 miles a day for weeks. 14 miles a day. I mean, I walk a lot. I mean, I'm telling you. Yes, I'm sorry, sir.
You mentioned Ricketts.
Yeah, James
Thoroughfare.
Ricketts.
Is that the same Ricketts who was in First Manassas on Henry Hill?
Yeah, as I said, as he stood here and had to decide whether to hold his position, he reflected that on Henry Hill, he hadn't got supported. He got shot 4 times and taken prisoner. Same Ricketts, yeah.
He was only a captain there. When he was at Thoroughfare, was he, what, a colonel or something?
He was a brigadier general.
Oh.
Because once he was released as a prisoner, he was given an advance in rank. So, good questions.
Oh, one more. Was Custer like online here? I mean, was Custer involved, or was he still in development?
I don't think he was here yet.
Okay.
He had Michigan units at Gettysburg, as
Okay.
you know, cavalry. And he was very active in, he was in Warrenton,
Okay.
but I think that was after this.
Okay.
I'll have to check.
All right, no
I
problem.
want to tell you
Thank
something.
you.
This is up.
Thank you for everything.
Yeah.
You missed the first part of your talk, but did you mention
Count yourself lucky. Go ahead.
Wonderful. We got so lucky to be here.
is this Thoroughfare battle? Jackson brought his troops from Delaplane by train?
Yes.
Okay.
What will astound you is how slowly the train moved. I think they could have actually, but they were also not putting in any effort, and they were lying on they actually were going so slowly they pulled one of the conductors out and shot him because they thought it was being
get out.
sabotaged.
Wow.
I think they were averaging 4 miles an hour or something. It took them like 10 hours to get from Delaplane to Manassas.
Was Johnston here? General
Johnston was at Harper's Ferry feigning an attack on Harper's Ferry so that the Yankees at Bull Run would think that the Confederates are not going to get any help from the West because they're fighting over in Western Virginia, and Jackson had been pulled away from Johnson.
He came from Winchester, right?
Well, he was with Johnston at Harper's Ferry. Then he went to Winchester. Then he came through Ashby Gap, came down Crooked Valley there, Piedmont Valley, and jumped on the train at Delaplane, which would have been called, if you're going to look at history maps, Piedmont Station.
I just finished reading Rebel Yell, and it's all in there.
Yeah,
All of those.
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Escape.
Thank you.